In the dark stage of Nazi Germany during World War II, the homosexual community, particularly men, faced relentless persecution. Continuous raids, ruthless scientific experiments, and inhuman tortures were part of the regular menu that the Third Reich imposed on these individuals. The Nazism, obsessed with the preservation of the Aryan race, considered gay people as a threat to this supposed racial purity, applying infamous and brutal methods against them, similar to those directed towards the Jewish community. In today's video, we will delve into this dark episode of history, closely examining the ruthless treatment that homosexual men and women experienced under the regime of the fearsome Adolf Hitler. Join us in this exploration of a discriminatory and heartbreaking reality in mid-20th century Germany. Welcome back to Military History. In the years leading up to the Nazis' rise to power in 1933, homosexual communities and networks flourished throughout Germany, especially in large cities. Despite same-sex relationships being penalized by law, the Weimar Republic displayed an open attitude towards these communities, allowing for their development and liberation. This was because the spirit following the Great War was much more liberal and tolerant. The hardships left by the conflict and its aftermath were countered socially by a libertinism that many frowned upon, but which others seemed to enjoy and promote. Let's take a look at some documentary moments capturing life in the Weimar Republic during those years.
Imagina que vas caminando por las calles de Berlín, cuando de repente ves un edificio en una esquina que tiene un fantástico cartel brillante en la fachada que dice, aquí es correcto.
However, everything changed drastically with the arrival of the Third Reich. The Nazi regime launched a brutal campaign, especially against male homosexuality, subjecting this community to violent persecution that took place between 1933 and 1945. Starting from 1933, the National Socialist totalitarianism harassed and dismantled as many homosexual communities as possible in Germany, arresting a large number of men under the infamous paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code. This article, which was in effect from 1872 until, incredibly, 1994, sanctioned and harshly punished gay relationships between men. However, it was in 1935 when the persecution of the gay community reached its peak, with an intensification and modification of paragraph 175. The legal revision of the mentioned clause increased the maximum penalty from 6 months to 5 years of imprisonment and expanded the activities considered criminal acts. This change provided Hitler's government with the necessary legal tools to prosecute and persecute a greater number of men for what they called homosexual behavior. The new article also imposed sentences of 1 to 10 years of forced labor in concentration camps for those who demonstrated unnatural and lustful attitudes. Under the Nazi version of the statute, a wide range of intimate and sexual behaviors were considered and punished as criminal. The Führer's men repressed homosexuality, considering it a manifestation of racial degeneration that could be transmitted as a vice or genetically from one individual to another. For this reason, they believed it was essential to eradicate it completely to prevent its spread among the population. It was considered the most dangerous of viruses to achieve the goal of the Aryan race, as explained by a specialist in the field.
The Nazis take a very conservative position, and this is part of what we'll get into the next panel, that homosexuality is a degeneracy that is weakening Germany. Fundamentally, for the Nazis, they wanted a larger German population, Panel 5. The goal is to have more Germans, more Aryan Germans, ultimately, toward the notion of a master race.
In the midst of the peak of the Third Reich, several events marked a radical turn in the persecution of homosexuality. This inevitably led to more systematic levels of oppression for individuals. In more direct words, a state was responsible for subjecting a portion of the population against their will due to strictly discriminatory reasons. A key episode was the execution of Ernst Röhm, a Nazi commander and alleged homosexual, along with 200 members of the SA, his paramilitary force, between June and July 1934. This violent chapter marked the beginning of a brutal repression and hunt against the gay community. The murders, carried out by direct order of Hitler, altered the Nazi propaganda narrative about homosexuality, using Rome's sexual identity to justify the crimes. Exploiting the prejudices ingrained in German society, National Socialist propaganda justified their persecution. Most terrible of all, these entirely discriminatory principles were accepted by a large portion of the German nation. Recognition that homosexual men were directly considered enemies of the regime occurred in 1936 when Heinrich Himmler, leader of the SS and chief of the German police, established the Reich Central Office for the combating of homosexuality and abortion. Integrated into the Kripo, the Nazi criminal police, this office closely collaborated with the Gestapo, a political shock force of the regime, to persecute and harass gay individuals. Himmler, known for his ruthless homophobia, perceived homosexuality and abortion as threats to the German birth rate and, therefore, to the continuity and strength of the German people. He thus initiated an intense and violent campaign aimed at eradicating what he considered deviations from the established norm. The Nazi regime redirected its efforts, moving away from the closure of gay meeting places and focusing more on the detention of individuals who violated Article 175. From the Reich's perspective, these individuals were directly classified as homosexual criminals. This legal figure deemed them criminals and enemies of the state, and we already know what kind of repressive state the Führer led. Heinrich Himmler held the belief that attacking these men was imperative for the protection, strengthening, and expansion of the German people and the purity of their race. The Kripo and Gestapo police forces led raids, filed reports, and employed intense interrogation and torture methods to track down and arrest those they considered gay individuals. These raids were public and high-profile events that were an integral part of the totalitarian government's campaign against homosexuality. Through these operations, the police sought to intimidate and scare gay communities and individuals while consolidating their power and gaining popularity through fear in the population. There were careful protocols designed to be as efficient as they were terrifying. Police officers established cordons around bars frequented by the community and interrogated anyone who seemed suspicious. Those deemed guilty by the police faced trials for violations of paragraph 175 or, in some cases, were sent directly to concentration camps. Thus, in Hitler's dark era, systematic persecution against homosexuality reached chilling levels. The Kripo and Gestapo relied heavily on reports from the civilian population to carry out a ruthless hunt for these homosexual criminals. Fear spread through society like a poison, causing neighbors, friends, or even family members to become police informants, pointing out those they deemed suspicious of homosexual behavior. Let's hear the testimony of one of the victims.
Vandalism means, like in German, schwul, in bad way. Yeah. And therefore I was treated bad. If I were thief, if I were murder, they could accept me, but not this.
The language used in these reports reveals the tragic alignment of the German population with Nazi ideology on this sensitive topic. Descriptions of those accused as effeminate, unmanly, sick, or perverted reflect the widespread acceptance of regime prejudices. Civilian accusations became an effective tool of repression, leading to tens of thousands of arrests and convictions. Once arrested, gay men faced intense interrogations by the Gestapo and Kripo, where physical and psychological brutality were commonplace. The police sought complete confessions using the pressure of extreme torture methods as tools. Under these inhuman conditions, men were also forced to reveal the names of their sexual partners, allowing the police to identify and detain more homosexuals for equally cruel interrogations. This sinister practice of the Nazi regime led to the capture of entire networks of gay men and their communities. Among the practices carried out by officers in their interrogations were verbal humiliations, savage beatings, and even abuses involving sexual intercourse, which seemed a contradiction that the Nazi agents themselves overlooked. When World War II broke out, military-aged men were conscripted, facing dangerous tasks and being sent to the front lines against their will. In this extreme situation, discrimination against homosexuality took a back seat. Soldiers were a precious asset, and the high command of the Reich could not afford to lose men in their militias. However, the perverse Nazi officials managed to continue harassing gay men. On the battlefield, they were assigned to the most difficult or dangerous tasks, as they were considered inferior. In more direct words, if they lost their lives, it wasn't as important as that of an Aryan soldier. During those years, castration was incorporated into the punitive arsenal, allowing some German prisoners detained in concentration camps to obtain early release by voluntarily undergoing the procedure. But what the government truly sought with this action was to stop perpetrating deviations in the purity of the Aryan race, among whom were gay Germans. However, it's interesting to note that it wasn't only the homosexual community who suffered these practices. In a ruthless act, Hitler's totalitarianism carried out its delirious vision of racial purification on July 14, 1933, by enacting the law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring. This new legislation granted the state the power to carry out racial cleansing in the population, thus revealing the twisted machinery of its objectives. As we can see, it was the same year that Article 175 was enacted, so we can trace a historical line of thought. Eliminating the different in pursuit of a supposed superior race, that was the perverse ambition of the Führer. The law was drafted by Falk Rüttke, a lawyer, Arthur Gutt, a physician and director of public health affairs, and Ernst Rudin, a psychiatrist and one of the early leaders of the German racial hygiene movement. The regulation imposed forced sterilization of men and women considered carriers of supposed hereditary conditions, such as mental weakness, schizophrenia, manic depressive disorder, genetic epilepsy, Huntington's chorea, genetic blindness and deafness, severe physical deformity, and chronic alcoholism. Additionally, it included those with more than 1/8 of Jewish ancestry in their lineage, and, as it couldn't be otherwise, also homosexuals. Surprisingly, these practices weren't conceived as punishments, but as supposed cures for what the Nazis considered a genetic deviation. Castration, whether voluntary or imposed, was widely applied. Additionally, brothels were used as part of attempts to cure homosexuality. Homosexual prisoners were forced to visit these places weekly and coerced into having sexual relations with women until they admitted that their sexual orientation was not natural. What's interesting is that not only men suffered discrimination and persecution. During that time, various lesbian communities developed, founding clubs and social associations to foster networks and connections among themselves, to protect themselves from conservative scrutiny. Although Nazism never criminalized sexual relations between women, they adopted a different perspective towards them compared to homosexual men. The fundamental distinction lay in the fact that, above all, lesbians were women. Within Nazi ideology, it was believed that German women had a special and unique mission. From the party's perspective, they held the responsibility to be mothers and contribute to the birth of racially pure Germans, thus ensuring the perpetuation of the Aryan race. For this reason, female homosexuality was considered a temporary disorder and susceptible to cure without major concerns for the Reich. Ultimately, the Nazis concluded that it was more practical to force them to have children, even at the expense of violating the rights of these citizens by the government. To put it bluntly, the Nazi German state and impregnated lesbian women during their time in power. As we said, this community was not the strongest target of discrimination and social mistreatment, but they were equally marginalized and punished by their compatriots. This unjust situation was stoically endured by women who now give their testimony with a hopeful and optimistic view of the present that is experienced today.
And I was also struggling with my identity as a gay person in a world where we didn't have the kind of support that there is today. And thank God, I am so happy for young people today who are gay, who don't have to go through what I had to, you know.
Based solely on prejudices and biased diagnoses, German authorities imposed sterilization on approximately 400,000 citizens. For men, vasectomy was the common method, while women underwent tubal ligation, a much more invasive procedure that ended up being fatal for hundreds of German women. As we mentioned earlier, in addition to chemical castration, other gay individuals were sentenced to prison, while some were sent to concentration camps to perform forced labor. In both scenarios, they faced relentless punishment and the consequent social marginalization perpetuated by the regime. Imprisoned in places like Auschwitz and Treblinka, prisoners were identified with a degrading pink triangle sewn onto their uniforms. This symbol not only marked them as captives, but also singled them out as a separate group in the cruel classification system of the camps. Additionally, this emblem was not only symbolic. Prisoners of the pink triangle were subjected to extreme abuse, both physical and sexual. What was most terrible was that those who carried out these violent acts were not only guards but also their own cellmates. This showed that homophobia was a toxin present throughout society. Between 5,000 and 15,000 men were imprisoned in concentration camps, and almost none survived. In Buchenwald, brutality reached unsuspected levels. Prisoners with the pink triangle were assigned exhausting tasks and at times were victims of public abuse and humiliations. It was common for them to be made to work until they collapsed, and then they were beaten for fainting in the middle of a task. Sometimes they were spat on or subjected to humiliations that, out of respect for the victims, we prefer not to mention in this video. But the cruelty didn't stop there. For Nazi ideologists and scientists, homosexuality was considered a hereditary malformation that needed to be cured. Homosexual behaviors were classified as dangerous crimes against morality, and the Reich sought to protect society from what they deemed genetic deviations. Dr. Karl Verney, a Danish physician of the SS, conducted inhumane medical experiments with the pretense of curing homosexuality. Practices ranged from the implantation of artificial glands created by himself, which supposedly released an artificial male sex hormone, to electroshock therapies and lobotomies. These atrocious procedures often resulted in the death of the prisoners. Forced castration was even authorized for those deemed guilty of dangerous crimes against morality. All these deadly experiments were carried out not only with the authorization of the SS leader, Himmler, but also by the Führer himself. Despite sounding like a true horror movie, this actually happened less than 100 years ago in a supposedly modern and civilized Europe.
All humanity was at stake. When you have a society and a government that is based on a perfect Aryan race, in which human beings are stratified in a hierarchical structure, the Aryan race at the top and everyone else below, all humanity is at stake.
Exploring the stories of homosexuals during the Nazi era was hindered throughout the 20th century due to persistent prejudices and the application of paragraph 1-75 in post-war Germany. According to official records of the Third Reich, around 140,000 men were prosecuted under different versions of Article 175. However, this figure only reflects part of the reality, as many Jewish homosexual men hid their true identity to avoid persecution and not worsen their situation as prisoners. Let's hear the testimony of someone who had access to these records and was horrified by what they found there.
The personal stories, this is basically what struck me. And as a gay Jewish man, I could not help but identify with each and every story of those people who were persecuted because of their homosexuality.
The complexity and brutality of the experiences of gay individuals during Adolf Hitler's regime are heartbreaking. The difficulty for Germans themselves to assimilate these sexual identities and the persistent conservative homophobia in their society have made uncovering the true magnitude of the atrocities during the Holocaust a challenge. Additionally, persistent social stigma and discrimination after World War II made it difficult to obtain accurate information about these victims. This dark chapter in history reveals the ruthless brutality inflicted on homosexuals during the Third Reich, an atrocity that underscores the urgent need to remember and learn from the horrors of the past. We are nearing the end of this installment, but before we conclude, we would like to hear your perspective on these atrocities suffered by gay men under the Nazi regime. Your comments are valuable, and we appreciate your participation. Thank you for sticking with us until the end, and we look forward to seeing you in the upcoming installments of Military History.